So Scott Williamson will be presenting the IPL plan, and Jeremy Weinstein will be brought in, a co-author, and they will present their suggested approach to the archiving or publication of null results. So this is Scott Williamson, a PhD student at Stanford.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today. As David mentioned, my name is Scott. I'm a PhD candidate at Stanford, focusing primarily on the Middle East and issues of authoritarianism and migration, and I am affiliated with the Immigration Policy Lab. So this proposal developed out of several discussions at IPL with a few teams of researchers. And as David mentioned, the initial motivation came when we ran a survey in Jordan looking at a few different issues, one of which was a series of treatments trying to mitigate hostility towards the Syrian refugee population among the host community. And unfortunately, these results turned up null, and we were trying to figure out what to do with them, and ultimately decided we probably didn't want to pursue a peer-reviewed publication, but we weren't satisfied with just sitting on the results because we did think they had important implications both for the scholarly community and for policy practitioners working on social cohesion issues in Jordan and elsewhere. And so that's where this is coming from. And just to speak about the bigger issue here, the problem is that researchers can't really observe the full set of research designs that have been conceptualized, implemented, and analyzed. And this is for a variety of reasons. For one, there's lack of transparency around planned research, although this is improving. There's selective reporting and publication of scientific findings due to difficulty of actually publishing, as well as scholars' own lack of interest in their own projects when you find that actually this didn't work as I had hoped. And this creates a number of issues. In particular, null results are less likely to be reported or published, both in the social sciences and in other disciplines as well. There's some good research on this now. And this creates a few problems. So first, reported effect sizes are likely biased upwards. And this means that when we try to evaluate what we do and do not know, we're missing important information. And then in addition to these problems, we're also probably just wasting a lot of time, energy, and resources trying to design studies that have already been done, and we just didn't know what turned out because we don't actually see them. So in short, it becomes much more difficult to build cumulative knowledge because of these problems where we're not seeing all of the research that is actually completed. Of course, it's not all bad. The credibility revolution of the social sciences has begun to address some of these other challenges of knowledge accumulation. So there is greater transparency of research designs now with pre-registration. And there's also greater transparency of data with the growth of reporting and replication. But these are primarily improvements for published studies, and they don't really address the problems that I just mentioned, because with pre-registration, you're still not seeing the results for studies that people don't pursue after they implement them. And same goes for data that's posted online for replicating actual published studies. So there have been a few solutions proposed for how to deal with this that have been discussed in depth. And we don't disagree with these solutions, but we don't think they're probably likely to solve this issue on their own. And so the first is results-free review and publication. And at least in political science, this was tried a few years ago by Comparative Political Studies, which is one of the top journals in comparative politics, in a special issue. And as you might expect, this special issue had more null findings than would typically be the case. And it was talked about in some political science outlets, including blogs like The Monkey Cage. And in some of this postmortem, the editors came out and said they were not likely to repeat the process. And they gave a few reasons for why that was. So first, they felt that this wouldn't actually help so much to protect against data phishing. They also thought that it would increase the difficulty of reviewing the analysis of papers adequately. And their reasoning there was that the reviewers are focused on design, but not the actual analysis that comes later. And so this puts more of a burden on the editors or a longer review process to verify what's been done. They also came out and said that even if it's difficult to determine what constitutes an important finding, that this is still something editors should do. And it becomes much harder to do that when you're only looking at the design. And then finally, they felt that this would inhibit the publication of non-experimental research. So you may not agree with all these points, but what we want to draw attention to here is that probably many editors do feel this way, at least in political science, and it may not be the case that this will actually catch on for some of these reasons. Likewise, there's been discussion of trying to set up a prestigious journal of null results to incentivize more frequent publication of null studies. And again, this is a great idea, but our feeling is that in practice, it's probably quite difficult for this to work, in part because it's hard to find editors and reviewers, and also because it is challenging to interpret null findings. And so a journal like this will probably be inundated with studies that it's very hard to sort through which of these are worth publishing. So our proposed solution after talking through this is to try and create a new norm similar to the norm that's developed around pre-analysis plans for scholars to report on their own null findings in the social sciences, even if they're not pursuing peer-reviewed publications. And so the idea here is that you would write and then post online a short summary of what you did and what the findings were once you've decided that you're not going to advance with peer review. So this obviously has a few challenges. First, time constraints. If you're not getting the publication, why would you take the time to do this? And then also perhaps people would be concerned with reputational costs if all of a sudden you have 12 unsuccessful studies posted on your website for 2 or 3 publications. Does this make you look bad? And so at IPL, we've tried to think about how we might overcome this. So first, in terms of time constraints, we've developed a template for what we're calling null results reports. And these would be short and easy to write to try and minimize the investment that people are putting into them, while still making them useful for people to learn from in the scholarly community. So the target would be something about 5 pages long. We hope that several components of these reports would be taken from pre-analysis plans or already completed analysis that you just do in the course of looking at did your study work or not. And so these components should reduce the workload. And then we've also designed a template that clearly outlines and structures the pieces that would be needed to make a useful report. And so we hope that at some point this could even be online and people will be able to go to this template and fill in a few boxes answering different questions and making sure they have the right components. And so in terms of what this would look like, first there would be a very simple outline of what the research question is and what your design was, a very basic summary of the findings. And here we think that even if many pre-analysis plans tend to be very long, that again, to minimize time investment, it's probably most useful to focus on the core finding of the study that you want people to learn from. But maybe that's something for discussion. And then we want people to go into potential explanations. And so here we've listed 5 that we think everyone should try to address or at least speculate about. Was the power adequate? Were there problems with your measurement? Were there implementation issues? Was there any unexpected spillover or contamination? And then finally, were there flaws in the theoretical priors that should be reconsidered? And so this is probably going to be speculative in many cases, and scholars should be open about that, but we still think it could be useful in terms of learning for future studies. And then finally, that's the last section. We would encourage researchers to write out what the implications are for the academic literature and also potentially for practitioners. So I'll just briefly talk through, we've written this up formally, but talk through the Jordan study that's been mentioned and what our report here looks like. So again, this was a study motivated by our interest in trying to reduce prejudice and hostility towards Syrian refugees in Jordan, given the scale of the Syrian refugee crisis in the country. More than 1 million refugees from Syria have come since 2011. And so we implemented a face-to-face survey with a sample of 1,200 Jordanians that was nationally representative, and then additional 300 Jordanians from areas with high refugee density. And we had a few batteries of questions on the survey, but one of them was 3 interventions that were informed by the literature on what motivates charitable giving, and our hope here was that we could prime more generous feelings towards Syrians that would translate into more support for hosting and assisting them. So here are the results. We had a treatment priming values, religious values about generosity for outsiders, a treatment priming awareness of the severe needs of the refugee community, and then a third treatment trying to prime a feeling of a warm glow or a feeling of joy about helping Syrians overcome their struggles. And as you can see, perhaps the joy of giving treatment would have been significant with a larger sample, but the others are pretty precisely estimated around 0. That was an index of about a dozen outcome questions. We also broke it down by into 4 separate indices, and again, you see consistent null findings. So these are the 2 plots that we have in the report. Very simple. These are the treatments. These are the results. And we don't go into a lot of the other analysis. This is the main point we want to take away from it. And so when considering what happened here, we did power calculations beforehand, and generally had ample power, but perhaps with a larger sample, the joy treatment would have been effective. No measurement issues. We don't think there are measurement issues here. We use pretty standard approaches. In terms of implementation, some of the enumerators reported that respondents seemed bored or uninterested in the treatments, which were text followed by a 2-minute video trying to prime the relevant intervention. And so perhaps this was part of what was going on. Maybe with different videos or a different medium, it would have been more effective. We don't think there are any spillover issues. And then finally, in terms of theoretical priors, perhaps strategies that provided genuinely new information or new frames for how to think about the crisis would have been more effective than trying to prime emotions, given how salient this crisis is in the Jordanian context and how this is always on people's minds anyways. And then finally, in terms of implications for scholars and practitioners, this is further evidence that attitude change on issues of prejudice are just very difficult to shift. Recently, there have been a few studies suggesting that using emotion to try and improve attitudes is a more effective approach, and this maybe pushes back against that slightly. And then finally, we think these results do have important implications for social cohesion programming in Jordan, since a lot of these programs draw on the kinds of messages we were using in our interventions, and also probably more broadly in other refugee contexts. So that was that's sort of an example of the null results report, and we hope this template will help mitigate the time problem, but obviously it's not going to erase it. It will still take time for scholars to write these up, and this won't necessarily solve any reputational concerns either. And so for that to occur, we think we really need institutions within academia to try and push a new norm around reporting and publicizing these types of reports. And so research communities like labs and departments are well positioned to create these expectations. And just as IPL is an example, we've written up a series of guidelines about what to do in cases like this. And so specifically, we will require all pre-registered studies in particular to have results posted online in some form, regardless of the outcome. And the plan is also to create a section on the website for these null results to be posted that will be visible to anyone coming to look at the website. However, we also think that funding organizations have an important role to play as well. And so perhaps here these organizations could require that award winners at some point will post a summary of results online after a predefined time period, regardless of what the outcome of the study actually is. Of course, there would probably be exceptions made for evidence of efforts to publish or continuing efforts to publish in peer-reviewed outlets, because you don't want to make it harder to do that. But the expectation here is that eventually, or if you decide not to publish, you will post something online. And then perhaps it would be possible to consider sanctions for noncompliance, even if only referencing online that this requirement hasn't been met, but that would probably be open for discussion. And then finally, we think that repositories for pre-analysis plans like those hosted by EGAP and the AEA could have an especially important role to play here. And that's for a few reasons. First of all, just in terms of accessibility and organization, these repositories now have a huge number of studies. They continue to grow. And so it's a natural place where anyone interested in finding which studies have been completed would go to look for these sorts of reports. Our idea is that they could be posted online next to the pre-analysis plan if and when scholars want to post the results. Again, as with funding organizations, our hope would be that the repositories themselves would require reporting of this after a set time period, or at least updating of what the progress is of the study. And again, potential sanctions for non-compliance. And then finally, we think these repositories are a natural place for this because this sort of reporting probably does work best with experimental research. And so again, it provides a natural community. So I will leave it there. I think Jeremy is listening and also available to answer questions. So happy to take your feedback and comments. Thank you.
So I have a question, sort of maybe talks a little bit. Sandra Foster, the editor of the Journal of Development Economics from Brown University, and an economist. What worries me, I sort of like the idea the archives are out there, but if there's sort of if we build it, they will come. And I think that's a real constraint, right? That when we are looking for articles on a topic we're working on, at least I automatically focus on the top general interest journals of economics as well as the top ones in my field. And I ignore pretty much everything else, right? And the problem with what you set up here is there's no jurying at all, right? And it strikes me, this is more cost and so forth, but doing this without jurying is a problem. And that what you really need is someone to kind of, if you were to do this, you would need to have a way of saying, okay, this was a good study, it just had a null result versus this was just a bad study. And it's the problem with, pre-analysis plans is anybody can submit them and everybody's supposed to submit them, but you have bad ones and good ones. So it strikes me without that, this isn't very helpful, but maybe a reaction.
So I'll see if Jeremy wants to jump in on this, but I should mention that in IPL, we are, as part of the guidelines, requiring that these reports be reviewed internally at least from 1 or 2 people, but obviously that's hard to scale up. I think part of our hope with if repositories could do this is that there would be at least a minimal review of are the components there. But yeah, I agree. At the end of the day, this is going to come down to other scholars feeling motivated to search for whether studies have been conducted and will they look at them, and that's potentially a constraint. I do think it could still be helpful in terms of at the design stage, maybe framing, maybe you primarily go to the top journals, but you still might want to look for what's out there more broadly. And if studies failed, because it's useful to know that even if the quality isn't necessarily great.
The one thing I'd add, Scott, if I can jump in, I don't know if folks can hear me, is Jeremy Weinstein. Sorry, I can't be there in person. I think this question of jury is really important, but obviously there are signals in our fields of reputation and quality beyond journal. And part of the sort of goal of creating a new norm here is to think about how we use departmental leadership and lab leadership to set norms, and sort of associational leadership like the AEA repository or the EGAP repository. So I think you're absolutely right. The speaker's absolutely right that one needs to be in a position to distinguish what is simply a poorly designed study versus a well-designed study that yields a null result. And so building in some sort of review process is important to that. But we also have other signals that are sent to us beyond journal of where we see higher quality studies. And so I think we have a story of let's start this norms change from below, in part because we've seen the lack of efficacy of all of the calls for, a sort of journal-wide, or field-wide journals that tackle this issue, because it really seems that the incentives to do so are pretty tough to reach at this stage.
Let me just follow up. Yeah, I can see the point, although you're saying we're going to, essentially focus on the work by the most well-known people, with people with the best reputations, that raises other concerns, right? It's not sort of an open process the way a journal typically should be. Not all journals are, where it's really open to anybody who does a good study. So it's the quality of the study that makes the determination, not the quality of the person. And that's a line that I am trying to be very careful about.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could say more about the model of change and the model of the behavioral model of the researcher. I would think that a researcher who's aiming to do things wants to they have a limited budget of time. They have particular ways of discovering information, so they're more likely to find things if, say, these cite papers that are in the field. And so, thinking about how people get to this, discover this when they're not looking for, for this result in this place, and how what signals they have that that helps them understand how to weigh this null result, whether it's peer review or something else, and if there were other things other interventions that you considered to also connect to this, like there are a lot of preprints. So I mean, could you make a type of easily discoverable preprint and have the benefit of locatability, et cetera, et cetera? So that, what's the theory of individual change and sort of institutional change in the requirements? Maybe you won't get there, but what do you see as critical for this to work?
Jeremy, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to take this? All right,
I'm muting. Sorry. So one thought that I'd add on this, I think in political science we've seen in very powerful ways the pre-analysis plan norm take hold, and it's increasingly the case that that is an expectation, even when we see job market papers come in that our search committees are reviewing the pre-analysis plan in addition to the paper itself, and making judgments even before it's gone through some sort of publication process. And you now see on folks' website, the place for the pre-analysis plan and the place for the working paper, and then the published paper, and then the data. And I think our vision is that the norm change that we want to see is that people are listing all of their projects in that way. And null results is a piece of that. And one of the powerful influences on that is going to be expectations that come both from below, which is your faculty advisors, your research community. For us in the immigration space, we pull people to our website and our work stream who are interested in immigration, and now they'll be able to find everything that we've tried to do. And so we have that kind of focal quality, but the AEA registry or the EGAP registry, to the extent that we can get to the point where null results reports are also in that environment, I regularly search that environment, when I'm designing a new experiment, even if, the results are not published. And so that provides, again, a focal location. Part of the motivation that you have to count on is that those of us who are in the position of designing research are wanting to make new contributions and wanting to avoid the inefficiencies of wasting our time on implementing research designs that have yielded null results in other contexts that we might be confident in. And this positions that researcher with that motivation to know where to go to find that kind of information.
Lars Vilhuber, economist at the AA. I want to reemphasize the point that some of my predecessors here have said about it needs to be findable. And findable actually has technical conditions on what is findable. Posting on personal websites and things like that is extremely ephemeral. and that's setting yourself up for failure. So this needs to integrate with the sort of infrastructure that's out there, and whether that's the data set search through Google, through DOIs, or whatever you want to do, you need to somehow be able to find it. And that suggests that it has to be a preprint server or something like that with some scalability that hooks into these things. In econ, preprints have a history of being searchable through the most commonly used ones because everything's in REPEC and all these kinds of things. And that's a very dispersed system, but it kind of works. But you can find it, and that's, I think, the key thing. So if they don't have DOIs or things like that, that's not a condition. It has to be findable. The other thing is you need some gatekeeper to start establishing these norms. I think you can try and do it with reputation of the biggest labs or something like that, and that kind of will work over time. There's some diffusion process which somebody should model and see when it fails and when it doesn't. Getting NSF to say you have to have this is one way of doing that, but again, it relies on infrastructure. If you can't simply click and search, say, when you go into Fastlane or reporting.gov and put in that particular null result or that particular set of 50 null results, because that may have been what you did, if that's not efficient, if that's not searchable, it won't happen. And if the referees of the next section won't get guidelines about how to review it, nobody cares. And so that's where it's very good to know that the NSF is interested in it, but there's technical tools in terms of doing that. We've seen that going on when you want to report on data creation as a legitimate academic outcome. There still is no way, no scalable way, say in NSF, to report on data assets created that are not necessarily tied to an article. You can cite articles as much as you want. It is really onerous to get data in there, and thus it's not in there and it's not evaluated by the next referees. So breaking that cycle is critical. But it relies on certain elements of the infrastructure in order to be able to do that.
Thank you. I think we completely agree with that. In terms of posting on individual websites and such, I think the goal there would just be to try and signal that this is increasingly a norm from the bottom up. But we definitely recognize that this won't work if these are not actually searchable and accessible. And so perhaps preprints are a good way to go. And one of our thoughts about the repositories is that these are generally tagged and searchable as well. So I don't know about citing them, but at least they would in theory be available for anyone who goes and looks for a certain topic.
Got one more question here.
Great. This is Ted McGill at Berkeley. Hey, Jeremy.
Hey.
I just wanted to make a comment, which is a little bit of the framing so far, which is totally understandable, was around, journals don't publish null results enough. I think all of us in the open science research transparency community have identified that for a long time as a huge problem. We need to get the results out there, and we're thinking of ways to do it. I just want to make sure that we don't think of any of these efforts to publish null results as a substitute for continuing to push for sort of norms change among the journals, because the first best is research is evaluated on its quality. Even if you have a null result, you can publish it in the journals. That's where we want to go. But it's taking a long time. It hasn't been as successful as we'd like. So we do need to get these results out there. But I just want to make sure we don't think of it as, well, we've given up on the journals publishing null results, so we're going to do this. We can do both. And I think it's been great to hear the reference to the long history of preprints or working papers in econ, which I think is spreading to other fields. So you really can get these results out there, and that doesn't preclude you from publishing eventually in a journal. So I just want to, as a frame of this overall conversation today, not make us think that we're going to give up on publishing null results in journals. That's still the first best. We want to go there. But hey, maybe it takes 5 or 10 years, or depending on the subfield, longer, where that becomes the norm, and we've got to get these results out there. So that was just more of a framing comment, but I think a lot of the points are really well taken about how we could do that. And maybe a big part of the conversation today is just thinking of, about the mechanisms. Is it going to be through working papers, registries? How are we going to get the results out there? We need to do that, but let's not give up on the broader goal. So,
I think we have time for one more.
Hi, thanks. I'm Elizabeth Marincola from the African Academy of Sciences, but I used to be CEO of PLOS, and this last comment inspires me to remind everybody that there are really excellent journals out there that not only accept but encourage the submission of null findings, and PLOS is one of them, and I noticed that you had a slide proudly showing off that you had published something in PLOS 1. So, and PLOS isn't the only one. So let's just not forget that some inroads have been made, and in fact, people think of PLOS as having been founded on the basis of open access, and it was, but one of the very initial founding principles was the publication of null findings.
Okay, we'll do one more and then we'll move on. But this is the exact discussion that we want.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Kate. This is exactly the discussion we want. That when, on the jury problem, how does the meta-analyst weigh a no-result paper versus a peer-reviewed published paper? And what weighting should it give? It could be just a junky project out there, and it shouldn't have the same weight. And Ted's point is, I think, completely right, that we shouldn't give up on the goal of seeing this in the scientific literature. And that's why we put this ecosystem there to say, at the present time, where are the best interventions? That, in my language, is where can we have the greatest scientific value with the least intrusive demands on our own time and our scientific community's efforts. And all of these interventions have small or bigger flaws, but trying to figure out where we can now get the greatest impact at different points in this system is, which I hope would be the goal for today's discussions.